let's talk a little bit then next about what sets CPTSD apart from PTSD. And before we even do that, let's talk about the emergence of this as a distinct term. I understand the World Health Organization played a key role in this.
Absolutely. So complex PTSD, it's recognized by the ICD, which is put out by World Health Organization. So the ICD stands for the International Classification of Diseases. And in 2022, the ICD-11 came out and they had a questionnaire called the International Trauma Questionnaire. It's 18 questions that helps to distinguish between PTSD versus complex PTSD. Now, when they think about PTSD, they ask questions about symptoms related to re-experiencing, symptoms related to avoidance, symptoms related to this sense of threat that's happening currently. And they differentiate between PTSD and complex PTSD based on if people are experiencing these recently, since a recent trauma, versus if they experience symptoms typically. So beyond just when they experience this recent trauma, or just more in general of how they might feel about themselves. With complex PTSD, now the ICD added a few other categories of symptoms, including affective dysregulation, negative self-concept, as well as disturbances in relationship. These three categories, they further kind of clump together as disturbances in self-organization. And these things are what differentiates PTSD versus symptoms of complex PTSD.
Even do that, let's talk about the emergence of this as a distinct term. I understand the World Health Organization played a key role in this.
Absolutely. So complex PTSD, it's recognized by the ICD, which is put out by World Health Organization. So the ICD stands for the International Classification of Diseases. And in 2022, the ICD-11 came out and they had a questionnaire called the International Trauma Questionnaire. It's 18 questions that helps to distinguish between PTSD versus complex PTSD. Now, when they think about PTSD, they ask questions about symptoms related to re-experiencing, symptoms related to avoidance, symptoms related to this sense of threat that's happening currently. And they differentiate between PTSD and complex PTSD based on if people are experiencing these recently, since a recent trauma, versus if they experience symptoms typically. So beyond just when they experience this recent trauma, or just more in general of how they might feel about themselves. With complex PTSD, now the ICD added a few other categories of symptoms, including affective dysregulation, negative self-concept, as well as disturbances in relationship. These three categories, they further kind of clump together as disturbances in self-organization. And these things are what differentiates PTSD versus symptoms of complex PTSD. So, for example, someone thinking about a child who's in an abusive home environment. So they might be told, no, you can't have if you cry, if you show that you're fearful, if you show that you're angry, you're going to get punished. And that punishment can look lots of different ways. It can be psychological punishment, where they get sent to a certain place that's dark and scary and where they're not allowed to leave. They may be told you're not allowed to come out even if you're hungry, or even if you need to use the bathroom. So body control. They might be groomed in a way where they're taught, wait, this is actually me showing you this is what love is. They might be victim to sexual abuse as well, where they're taught this is what love is. Where normally someone of that age wouldn't even understand some of those sexual behaviors.
Well, let me just add to the complexity of all of this, Patricia, and ask you about the co-occurring disorders that can come into play as well. Mood disorders, personality disorders, substance misuse, PTSD. Can you have PTSD and CPTSD at the same time?
That is a tricky question because according to ICD-11, it's one or the other. However, what's tricky is someone could have childhood trauma that shows up as complex PTSD and then have a recent or more recent trauma. And so how do you do that of saying, no, you can only have one? So I think there's something to it. And of course, if someone does have complex PTSD from childhood trauma that was recurring, it's going to lend itself to showing up a little differently too, where a lot of times people will say it will reinforce some of those beliefs. It will reinforce some of those patterns that have already formed or developed.
Okay, so you mentioned the World Health Organization and the ICD. Not to get us too much in the weeds here, but let's talk about the DSM and how that plays into all this, because that's what we use here in the United States, correct?
You got that. So the DSM, it's our Diagnostic Statistics Manual. It's what we use in psychiatry to diagnose and guide treatment for different diagnoses, different psychiatric behavioral health diagnoses. A name that you're going to hear a lot, Judy Herman. She was very involved in a lot of the field trials to research, update the diagnoses for the DSM. She clearly recognized that there are 3 cardinal symptoms of childhood abuse, including somatization, or noticing differences, physical symptoms that can happen in your body, dissociation, so disturbances of being connected and feeling like you're present in your own body or with your own emotions, and then affect regulation. So some of those overlap in how the ICD-11 sees it. At the time when she was presenting these ideas, trauma-related disorders were under anxiety disorders. So it was kind of tricky because all of these things are important and very key and important pieces to complex PTSD. But the problem was that it doesn't quite fit under anxiety disorders, and there are separate categories for dissociative disorders. There are separate categories for somatic disorders, and there are separate categories for personality disorders. So where does it fit? What ended up happening is that it eventually got acknowledged a little bit under associated features of PTSD. So in the DSM-5, it says, following prolonged, repeated, severe traumatic events, such as childhood abuse, torture, etc., the individual may experience difficulties in regulating emotions, maintaining stable personal relationships, or dissociative symptoms. Doesn't quite get to all of the intricacies involved with complex PTSD, but at least it's somewhat recognized in there. And I think there's a lot of work, a lot of research going into being able to have it be its own separate diagnosis.
So at this point in time, there is still some debate within the professional community whether or not it should be pulled out as a separate distinction?
It's been an ongoing thing. There's a long history there. There's a lot of people who are very well researched and working really hard to get it in there.
How does CPTSD or trauma manifest physically in the body?
In so many ways. I really appreciate that question. There is a whole new treatment out there, sensory motor treatment. Pat Ogden, Janina Fisher, they do these wonderful presentations. They do wonderful trainings. They have books out there on it. So trauma can manifest physically because there's so much stress going through your body, and that stress has been going on for so long. If we just pause to think about that for a second, if someone is in this hyper-aroused state for such a prolonged period during a time when they are so young and where they're supposed to be growing, we can only imagine how that might take effect or cause impact one's body. Again, remembering developmentally, this is at a time when you're supposed to be learning how to listen to your body, learning when you're tired, when you're hungry. All these cues physically of what's going on for you. So a lot of times we'll also see this in pain. So chronic pain that feels like no one can fully understand where it comes from, how it manifests. And again, people often going to a lot of specialists, a lot of medical providers where they feel then that no one understands me, or they feel that no one can give me a full diagnosis for what's going on. And sometimes there is a diagnosis. And if there is a chronic diagnosis, thinking about the extent that stress can then exacerbate that diagnosis to be even more intensive. So someone who has a chronic pain disorder, if they are still dealing with stress or trauma or going through the process of doing this type of work and treatment, it might exacerbate all of that to be even more intensive. It's important to hold on to both that medical, physical piece as well as the mental health piece. And what I often encourage people to do is to try to bridge that gap as best as possible by having a team that can work together.
To squeeze in one more, because we've had several questions about EMDR and its role in treatment. Can you speak to it, specifically what it is and whether or not it is used in the treatment of CPTSD?
Yeah, so EMDR, I'm going to kind of give the broader view of it. So it is considered a stage 2 treatment. So it's around processing of trauma, where they use eye movements or tapping. So bilateral movements. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So it initially started with eye movements, but they found that instead of just eye movements, they could use bilateral movements involving tapping as well, where you desensitize the trauma. So the narrative, the trauma narrative, and then you reprocess it to replace some of the thought processes that went along with the trauma. Some of the, I know I mentioned stuck points before, but some of these trauma beliefs that people may have developed from trauma, and you're reprocessing them. So you're trying to take those memories, reprocess them to be more positive ones. Is there a place for it in terms of complex PTSD? Again, there's still more research going on to understand it. I have heard of clinicians who are able to successfully do it and work with people. But again, it's a matter of finding the providers who feel comfortable doing that. Finding the providers who not only do EMDR, but do EMDR specific for complex PTSD and who feel comfortable and adept at doing that.